In the summer of 2003, I began filming the series Atheism, A Rough History of Disbelief. As part of the process, I talked to a number of writers, scientists, historians, and philosophers. Having secured their cooperation, I was very embarrassed to find that a large proportion of what went on ended up on the cutting room floor, simply because the series would have lasted 24 hours otherwise. Well, as it happens, the BBC agreed with me that the conversations were too interesting to be junked. And with these 6 supplementary programs, they've made the extremely unusual decision to go back to the original material and to broadcast at length some of the conversations which I had. Conversations with people such as the English biologist Richard Dawkins, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, the American playwright Arthur Miller, the English philosopher Colin McGinn, and the American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. Now, in his long professional life as one of America's most distinguished playwrights, Arthur Miller has brought warmth, wit, and intelligence to bear on the American scene. When I met him in his New York apartment, I asked him about his early life, about his attitude to Judaism, and the extent to which he felt that there has grown up in our time a strange association in the Christian mind between Judaism and disbelief, the idea that there's something peculiar about the Jews which makes them peculiarly susceptible to profane disbelief.
Well, of course, the anti-Semitism goes under 1,000 disguises, and one of them is certainly that the Jews are atheists at heart.
Well, of course, they don't believe in Christ, and that makes anybody, if not an atheist, then pretty close, a heathen, perhaps.
When you were a boy in Brooklyn, were you in an Orthodox or observing family?
They were observing 2 or 3 times a year. Apart from that, they were busy trying to make a living, and the rest of it. We were not. They were. If they were anything, they were observant or Orthodox. But that only occurred during the high holidays. The rest of the time, they were free to do whatever they wanted. They didn't go to synagogue every Saturday. They didn't pray. It was a kind of obedient nod in the right direction.
But as a child of that type of family, which I suppose in some way was similar to mine, though it was perhaps less observant than the one you described, did you yourself begin to differ from the Orthodox background from which you came?
Well, I tried to be a religious person when I was 12, 13, 14. It lasted about 2 years. And then it simply vanished. I simply laid down one evening to go to sleep and woke up the next day and it wasn't there anymore. And I guess it was part of my growing up that I would be searching for my roots somewhere, and I found them elsewhere. I didn't find them in religion, because religion, especially in the Depression 30s, seemed absolutely absurdly irrelevant. We were in the midst of a terrific social crisis here, and the religious in general had nothing to say about it.
But were there other reasons apart from the political irrelevance of religion? Did you have, as it were, other reasons, say, sort of rational reasons for thinking?
Of course, I no longer could believe. I quickly, at some point in my late teens, began reading and surmising that the idea of religion was a creation of man's longing to signify, to be a permanent part of the universe. And as I've grown older, I have to respect some of the religious people, because some of them, as you know, during the struggles we've had, have been terrific. And they've been motivated by religious principle in many cases. and therefore I don't dismiss the whole means. For myself personally, I don't have the talent to believe. That's the way I look at it. I simply haven't got, I keep seeing my grandfather instead of God. And it doesn't work anymore. But philosophically, if I can use that word, it just seems to me so patent that what man has done is to project himself into the heavens where he can be all-powerful, as he's not here, and moral, and decent, and vengeful, and all the things he's not allowed to do on the earth, and to don that white garment and the beard, and be what he wished in his dreams he could be.
And it just, I can't get past that.
These childhood memories prompted another thought about the extent to which religious skepticism amongst certain Jews was associated with left-wing sympathies. So I asked Arthur Miller if he thought that this supposed association had any part to play in the development of 20th century anti-Semitism. There is an undoubtedly close relationship between Jews and the left, and also a sort of a trio of beliefs: disbelief in God, Judaism, and an affiliation with the very political movements which might have to be the ones which are recruited in order to bring about a solution to the problems that you've described. Yeah. Now, so why do you think, though, what is this relationship?
For one thing, the Jews felt that was a different period than now in one respect. The anti-Semitism in the United States was rampant. It was open. For example, many people had to go to Europe to become doctors. Mm-hmm. They weren't admitted to Columbia University, to almost all American universities had a quota on Jews, and it was very small. There was the largest radio audience in the United States was for a man who was quoting Goebbels all the time.
This was Father Coughlin. Mm.
He had the largest audience, excepting for FDR. He was saying how wonderfully the Nazis had dealt with unemployment, how fine it was that they were defending their racial purity. This from a Catholic priest. I remember walking down the street in Brooklyn one day, a hot day in the middle of July, and all the windows were open. And I think it was on a Sunday afternoon, and from one house after another, you could hear that voice. And it was a sneering, raucous. He was a real rabble-rouser. He blamed the Jews for the Depression. Mm-hmm. That was the fundamental thing, that the money lenders had been thrown out of the temple, but they were back in. And they controlled the currency, they controlled the big corporations, they controlled everything, secretly. They were the secret demon underlying the troubles of the state. I was a worker in those days. I was out driving trucks and the rest of it, and you could cut it with a knife. It was brutal, and it was open. There was no question about it. So Jews were already positioned vis-a-vis the society as being, they weren't being killed, they were simply being gently and firmly kept out of the mainstream. No big corporation had Jewish executives. It was unheard of. So one understood what persecution might be, and therefore you were driven to the left, because the right was not interested in these problems, nor were most liberals. It was too dangerous. After all, a shipload of Jews from Germany arrived in New York Harbor and was not permitted to land. And these were not impoverished, desperate people. You know, these were middle-class people to have had the money to make this trip and to pick up all their stuff and move out of Germany. And they were sent back. It was called, the name of the ship was the St. Louis. And then they went from here to Cuba, where, from the studies I've read, the Americans did not want the Cuban government, which was then a dictatorship of the right, to let them in, lest it show up what we had done and reveal the cruelty of what we had done. Nobody was interested in confronting this thing, and they were sent back to Germany. I presume they were all killed.
Well, I remember talking to a Polish intellectual and him saying, we can accept the idea that Jesus was Jew, but what sticks in our throat is the idea that the Holy Mother was Jewish.
Oh, God. It's exhausting just to think about where to begin to throw light on this whole thing. I wrote a play called The Creation of the World and Other Business, which is about Genesis. And I didn't mean to, but I got involved with the Bible in a way that I'd never had before. And it's very interesting that the old rabbis, whoever put the Bible together, which was obviously written by different people at different times in history, they could have chosen any book to start the Bible. It was, no doubt, or the whole thing was lying on a table in front of them. Some editor had to say, this is the opener. And they opened with a fratricide. And the fratricide was there, I suppose, because that's the worst thing that can happen, is that two brothers, one of them is killed by the other brother because it doesn't involve the outsider.
And yet it does. You see, I remember reading, I don't know whether you ever saw this book by Ruth Melinkoff called I think it's called The Outsider, and it's a collection of images in art history of the representation of these various figures in the Bible. And in the early years of the 16th century, Cain is Jewish, Abel is Gentile.
How did that happen?
Just the way they in order to get round the problem of the fratricide, they had to somehow retrospectively identify the villainous Jew. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. In some of these early German pictures, you see this blonde Abel and this ringleted and bearded Cain.
I'll tell you a quick story. In the early 50s, I was traveling with a friend of mine in Foggia, because at the moment he was looking for an aunt he'd never met, who was a school teacher in the city of Foggia. And we found her, and he's Italian-American and Catholic. And she was curious to know what I was. And he said, he's Hebreo, he's Jewish. And she looked surprised. And he said, you know the people in the Bible? She said, oh yes. She says, well, as long as they believe in Christ. Of course, I suppose it's inevitable that, and will always be there to some degree, that one's own group being most familiar is less dangerous than an out group, which is always menacing because it's strange. They look different. They don't speak the way we do. They break their boiled egg on the narrow end instead of the broad end. This is going to go on forever, but when politicians seize upon these differences or these apprehensions,
particularly the religious differences,
and when they make religious differences the center of the political program,
that's when the end is nigh.